Part 1. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through Oakwood Cemetery as John Harrison knelt before a small marble headstone. His designer suit hung loose on his frame, the fabric unable to hide the 30 pounds he'd lost since the funeral 6 months ago. His hands trembled as they traced the carved letters. Isabella Grace Harrison, beloved daughter, forever 9. John had built an empire from nothing. The son of a factory worker and a school janitor, he'd clawed his way through poverty and doubt to become one of the most successful black real estate developers in America. His company owned commercial properties in 12 states. Forbes had called him a visionary. Business Insider had profiled his rise from nothing to everything, but none of it mattered anymore. 6 months ago, a fire had consumed the guest house on his property. By the time firefighters arrived, there was nothing left but ashes and charred remains that investigators identified as his 9-year-old daughter. Electrical accident, they'd said. Tragic. Unavoidable. The funeral had been attended by over 500 people. Politicians, business leaders, celebrities who'd never met Isabella but wanted to be seen paying respects. John remembered none of their faces. He only remembered the tiny casket being lowered into the ground and the feeling that his heart was going down with it. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered now, his voice cracking. "Daddy's so sorry he couldn't save you." What John didn't know was that his daughter wasn't dead. She was standing 20 feet away, hidden behind an old oak tree, watching him cry. Her clothes were torn and filthy. Her hair was matted. Her bare feet were bleeding from running through the woods all night. But she was alive. Isabella had been held captive for 6 months in an abandoned farmhouse deep in the countryside. Her prison was a small room with a mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and a window that had been nailed shut. A man she knew only as the guard brought her food twice a day and locked the door behind him. For months, she'd studied every detail of her captivity. She learned that the guard drank heavily on Saturday nights, often passing out before midnight. She memorized the sounds of his footsteps, the rhythm of his snoring, the location of every creaky floorboard between her room and the back door. 3 weeks ago, she'd found a key the guard had dropped while drunk. It had slid under her door, and she'd hidden it beneath her mattress, waiting for the right moment. Last night had been that moment. She'd slipped out while he snored in his chair, the smell of whiskey thick in the air, and ran through the dark woods until she reached the edge of the city. But she couldn't go home. During her captivity, she'd overheard phone conversations between the guard and someone he called the boss. A woman's voice on speakerphone, cold and businesslike. Isabella had recognized that voice. It belonged to Stella, her stepmother. "He's getting weaker," the guard had reported 2 weeks ago. "The medication is working." "Good," Stella had replied. "Once he's gone, we inherit everything. Just make sure the girl stays hidden. We might need her later." Isabella didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood enough. Her father was being poisoned. Her stepmother was killing him slowly, and they were keeping her alive as insurance. She couldn't go to the police. She was 9 years old, covered in dirt and scratches, with no proof of anything. They would call Stella. They would send her home, and then she would disappear forever. So she'd come to the only place she knew her father would be. Now, watching him sob before her grave, Isabella felt her own tears falling. The man who'd once seemed invincible looked broken beyond repair. His shoulders shook with each cry. His hands trembled against the cold stone. Then her father said something that shattered her hesitation. "I can't do this anymore, Isabella," John whispered. "I can't keep living without you. Maybe it's time I join you." Isabella's heart nearly stopped. Her father wanted to die. He was giving up. If she didn't act now, she might lose him forever. She stepped out from behind the tree. "Daddy?" Part 2, the word came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the silence of the cemetery it carried like thunder. John's body went rigid. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. He'd heard that voice in his dreams every night for 6 months. He'd imagined it in crowds, in empty rooms, in the quiet moments before sleep. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Slowly, he turned. There she was. Thin, dirty, her hair matted and her clothes torn, but unmistakably, impossibly alive. Isabella. The name came out as a choked gasp. "It's me, Daddy, it's really me." John scrambled to his feet, nearly falling in his haste. He crossed the distance between them in 3 unsteady steps and dropped to his knees before her, his hands hovering over her shoulders as if afraid she might dissolve at his touch. "This isn't real," he breathed. "You're not real. I'm dreaming." Isabella took his trembling hands and pressed them against her face, her warm, living, tear-streaked face. "I'm real, Daddy. I'm alive. They took me. They kept me locked up, but I escaped. I'm here." The dam broke. John pulled his daughter into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. His body shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. A sound of pure, overwhelming relief mixed with rage and confusion and desperate love. "My baby," he kept repeating. "My baby girl. Oh God, my baby girl." They held each other for what felt like an eternity. When John finally pulled back, his eyes were red and his face was wet. But something had changed in his expression. The broken man from moments ago was gone. In his place was something harder, something dangerous. "Who did this?" His voice was low and controlled, but Isabella could hear the fury beneath it. "Who took you? I'll kill them, I swear I'll kill them with my bare hands." "Daddy, listen to me." Isabella gripped his hands tightly. "It was Stella and someone else. I don't know who, but I heard his voice on the phone. They're poisoning you. The medication you're taking, the tea she makes you, it's killing you slowly. They want your money." John's face went pale. "Stella, that's impossible. She's been taking care of me." She's been killing you," Isabella interrupted, her young voice carrying a weight no child's voice should hold. "I heard them talking. They said a few more months, maybe less. Daddy, you have to believe me." For a moment, John simply stared at his daughter. The girl who'd left him 6 months ago had been sweet, innocent, sheltered. The girl standing before him now had eyes that had seen too much, survived too much, grown up too fast. He believed her, God help him, he believed every word. "We're going to the police," he said, standing abruptly. "Right now, we're going to—" "No." Isabella grabbed his arm. "Daddy, we can't. If they find out I'm alive, they'll kill us both. The man who guarded me, he'll tell them I escaped. They're probably already looking for me. If we go home, if we go to the police, if anyone sees me." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. John felt his rage collide with a terrible realization. His daughter was right. He couldn't simply expose Stella, not without putting Isabella in immediate danger. These people had staged a fire, faked a death, kept a child prisoner for 6 months. They would not hesitate to kill again. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much darkness. But beneath the fear, beneath the trauma, there was something else. A spark of determination that reminded John of himself. "We have to be smarter than them," she said. "We have to make them think they've won. And then we have to destroy them." Part 3. John drove Isabella away from the cemetery using back roads, his mind racing through possibilities. He couldn't take her home. He couldn't check into a hotel. Her face had been on every news channel for weeks after the fire. Someone might recognize her. He needed help from someone he could trust absolutely. David Mitchell had been John's personal attorney for 20 years. They'd met when John was still a struggling developer trying to close his first deal, and David was a young lawyer hungry to prove himself. Over 2 decades, they'd built not just a professional relationship, but a genuine friendship forged through late nights, hard deals, and moments when John had trusted David with secrets that could have destroyed him. John called David from a pay phone at an abandoned gas station, unwilling to risk using his cell phone. "I need you to meet me," John said without preamble. "Alone. Don't tell anyone. Don't ask questions until you see me." David, to his credit, didn't hesitate. "Where?" An hour later, David's car pulled into the parking lot of a closed warehouse on the outskirts of the city. When he stepped out and saw John standing beside a thin, disheveled girl, his face went pale. "My God," David breathed, "is that It's Isabella, John confirmed. She's alive. She's been held captive for 6 months, and the people who took her are the same people who have been slowly poisoning me. John told David everything. The kidnapping, the faked death, Isabella's captivity, the overheard phone calls, Stella's involvement. As he spoke, David's expression shifted from shock to horror to cold, calculated fury. "If we go to the police now, they'll contact Stella immediately," David said when John finished. "Standard procedure. And without concrete evidence, it becomes your word against hers. A grieving widow versus a man who might be suffering from delusions brought on by trauma." "So what do we do?" John asked. David was quiet for a long moment, his legal mind working through scenarios. Finally, he spoke. "We set a trap, but it has to be perfect. One mistake and you both end up dead." The plan took shape over the following hours. Isabella would stay at David's private apartment, a small place he kept in the city for late work nights, unknown to anyone except his accountant. She would remain hidden there, completely off the grid, while John returned home to continue the charade. "You have to act normal," David instructed. "Weak, grieving. Let Stella think her plan is working. But whatever she gives you to drink or eat, find a way to dispose of it without her knowing." "And then?" John asked. "Then we gather evidence. I'll get you recording equipment, small cameras, audio devices. We document everything." David met John's eyes. "And when we have enough, you're going to die." John understood immediately. A fake death. Stella and whoever she was working with were waiting for him to die so they could inherit. If he died suddenly, they would rush to claim everything. They would get careless, and that's when they would be exposed. It was risky. It was dangerous. It was also the only plan that might actually work. John knelt before Isabella, who had been listening silently. "I have to go back to the house," he told her. "I have to pretend like none of this ever happened. It might take weeks, and you'll have to stay here alone, waiting. I know that's asking too much after everything you've been through." Isabella's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "I survived 6 months in that room, Daddy. I can survive a few more weeks if it means we win." John pulled her into an embrace, fighting back tears. His 9-year-old daughter had more courage than most adults he knew. "I'll come see you whenever I can," he promised. "And this will end. I swear to you, this will end." Part 4. The following 3 weeks were the hardest of John's life. He returned home and resumed his role as the grief-stricken widower. Stella greeted him with practiced concern, her soft voice and gentle touches hiding the monster beneath. Each morning she brought him tea. Each evening she prepared his dinner. And each time, John found ways to dispose of what she gave him. Pouring tea into potted plants when she wasn't looking. Scraping food into napkins and flushing them down the toilet. He installed the cameras David had provided. Tiny devices hidden in smoke detectors, picture frames, electrical outlets. He wore a recording device under his clothes whenever Stella was nearby. And slowly, the evidence accumulated. He captured Stella on the phone with someone she called Mark, discussing how much longer he might survive. He recorded her complaining about the delay, about how she was tired of playing nursemaid to a dying man. He documented the small amber bottles hidden in her closet, labels removed, contents unknown. But the most damning evidence came 10 days into his surveillance, when Mark Harrison came to visit. John had always known his brother resented him. Growing up, John had been the ambitious one, the driven one. Mark had drifted through life, taking shortcuts and making excuses. When John built his empire, he'd given Mark a position as chief financial officer, partly out of family loyalty, partly out of guilt. He'd never imagined his brother's jealousy ran deep enough for murder. But there it was, captured in crystal-clear audio. Mark and Stella sitting in the living room, believing John was asleep upstairs, discussing their plans. "The doctor says he's deteriorating faster now," Stella reported. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks." "Good," Mark replied. "I'm tired of waiting. Once he's gone and we get the inheritance, we can finally get rid of the girl too. She's a loose end. We'll deal with her after the estate is settled." For now, she's our insurance policy." John had listened to the recording in David's car later that night, his hands shaking with rage. His own brother, his own wife, conspiring to kill him and eventually murder his daughter. All for money. "I want to destroy them," John said, his voice barely controlled. "You will," David assured him. "But we do this right. We do this in a way they can never recover from." Meanwhile, in David's apartment, Isabella waited. Those 2 weeks were a different kind of torture. She was safe. She was fed. She had a warm bed. But she was also alone for hours at a time while David worked and her father gathered evidence. The nightmares came every night. Dreams of the dark room, the locked door, the guard's footsteps. She would wake up gasping, reaching for a father who wasn't there, and have to remind herself that she was free, that this was almost over. But the fear never quite left her. What if something went wrong? What if Stella discovered the truth? What if her father's fake death became real through some terrible accident? She kept these fears to herself. Her father had enough to worry about without her adding to his burden. So she waited. She watched the news. And she counted down the days until she could finally stop hiding. 3 weeks after Isabella's escape, John Harrison died. Part 5, the plan was executed perfectly. David had brought in a trusted doctor, a man who owed John his life after John had funded his daughter's cancer treatment years ago. Together, they staged a collapse in the Harrison home. Stella called 911 in hysterics. Paramedics arrived and rushed John to the hospital. 2 hours later, the doctor emerged with grave news. John Harrison had suffered a massive heart attack. Despite their best efforts, he could not be saved. The death certificate was signed. The body was cremated to prevent any awkward questions, and the news spread across the country within hours. "Black billionaire John Harrison dead at 45, the headlines read. "Real estate mogul succumbs to heart failure after months of grief over daughter's death." Stella played her role masterfully. She wore black. She wept for the cameras. She spoke movingly about her husband's broken heart, how he'd never recovered from losing Isabella, how she'd watched him fade away despite her best efforts to save him. Mark stood beside her at the press conference, his face arranged in solemn grief, speaking about the brother he'd loved and lost. The public mourned. Social media filled with tributes. And Stella and Mark began the process of claiming their inheritance. Meanwhile, in David's apartment, Isabella watched the news coverage on a small television, her father sitting beside her. "They think they've won," John said quietly. Isabella leaned against his shoulder. "They haven't." "No," John agreed. "They haven't." The waiting was agony. From his hiding place, John monitored Stella and Mark's movements through the cameras still active in his home. He watched them celebrate with champagne the night after his funeral. He listened to them discuss which properties they would sell first, how they would divide the fortune, what they would do with their new freedom. He also watched them grow careless. Without John to monitor, they spoke openly about their crimes. They called the guard who had held Isabella, a man named Ray, and instructed him to clean up the farmhouse. They discussed the timeline for dealing with Isabella once the estate was settled. John documented everything. David built the case, and the date for the inheritance hearing approached. The inheritance hearing was held in the downtown courthouse, a grand stone building that had seen countless legal battles over its 100-year history. Media trucks lined the street outside. Reporters jostled for position. The death of a black billionaire and the disposition of his fortune was national news. Inside the courtroom, Stella sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in elegant black, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Mark sat beside her, his expression appropriately somber. Their attorneys had prepared all the necessary documents: the will, the death certificate, the proof of marriage and blood relation. The judge reviewed the paperwork with meticulous care. Everything appeared to be in order. John Harrison had died, and his wife and brother were the legal heirs to his estate. "If there are no objections," the judge announced, "I am prepared to authorize the transfer of assets to the surviving family members." Stella picked up the pen to sign the documents. Her hand was steady. Why wouldn't it be? Everything had gone exactly according to plan. John was dead. Isabella was hidden away, ready to be disposed of, and the fortune she'd spent 3 years cultivating was finally within her grasp. She signed her name with a flourish. Mark signed after her, allowing himself a small smile. The judge reached for his stamp, and then the courtroom doors burst open. Part 6. Every head turned. Cameras swung toward the entrance. Stella's pen clattered to the table as the color drained from her face. John Harrison stood in the doorway, alive, tall, his eyes burning with cold fury, and beside him, holding his hand, was Isabella, the daughter everyone believed had died in a fire 6 months ago. "I think," John said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "there may be some objections after all." The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Spectators leaped to their feet. But John's eyes never left Stella and Mark, who sat frozen at their table like deer caught in headlights. David Mitchell entered behind John, accompanied by 2 FBI agents and a thick folder of evidence. He approached the bench and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, I represent John Harrison, who is, as you can see, very much alive. I am also presenting evidence that Stella Harrison and Mark Harrison conspired to kidnap Mr. Harrison's daughter, fake her death, and slowly poison Mr. Harrison in order to inherit his estate. We have video recordings, audio surveillance, and testimony from the man they hired to hold Isabella captive." He placed the folder on the judge's bench. "We request that both defendants be taken into custody immediately." Stella finally found her voice. She leaped to her feet, her composure shattered. "This is insane," she screamed. "That's not possible. He's dead. She's dead. I watched her burn." "Did you?" John asked coldly. "Or did you just assume your plan worked?" He looked at his brother, who had not moved, had not spoken, seemed incapable of doing either. "You were going to kill me, Mark. Your own brother. For money?" Mark's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The FBI agents moved forward. One approached Stella, who backed away, still screaming denials. The other went for Mark, who offered no resistance, his face blank with shock. As the handcuffs clicked around Stella's wrists, she twisted toward John, her mask finally falling away to reveal the hatred beneath. "You should have just died," she spat. "You were supposed to die. This was supposed to be mine." John said nothing. He simply pulled Isabella closer, shielding her from the chaos, and watched as the woman who had tried to destroy his family was dragged away. The cameras captured everything. By nightfall, the story would be on every news channel in America. But in that moment, in the pandemonium of the courtroom, John Harrison felt nothing but the warmth of his daughter's hand in his. They had won. The weeks that followed were a blur of police interviews, legal proceedings, and endless media attention. Stella and Mark were formally charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Ray, the guard who had held Isabella captive, was arrested at a bus station trying to flee the state. He confessed everything in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing the final pieces of evidence that sealed Stella and Mark's fate. The story dominated headlines for days. Black billionaire rises from the dead to expose family betrayal. 9-year-old survivor helps father take down would-be killers. News vans camped outside the Harrison estate. Interview requests flooded David Mitchell's office. Everyone wanted a piece of the miraculous story. John refused them all. He had no interest in being a spectacle. The only thing that mattered now was his daughter. Part 7. But even with their enemies behind bars, the battle was far from over. The wounds Stella and Mark had inflicted went deeper than poison and imprisonment. They had scarred something fundamental in both father and daughter. Their ability to trust, to feel safe, to believe that the world wasn't full of people waiting to hurt them. The first night back in their home was the hardest. John had considered selling the estate, starting fresh somewhere without memories of betrayal lurking in every corner. But Isabella had asked to see her old room, and he couldn't deny her that. They walked through the front door together, and Isabella's hand tightened around his. The house looked the same as it always had. Elegant, spacious, filled with expensive furniture and tasteful art. But it felt different now. Contaminated. Every surface Stella had touched, every room where she had smiled her false smile seemed tainted by her presence. Isabella stopped at the foot of the stairs, staring up toward the second floor where her bedroom waited. "I don't know if I can go up there," she said quietly. John knelt beside her, bringing himself to her eye level. His daughter had been so brave, braver than anyone should ever have to be. She had survived 6 months of captivity, escaped through the woods alone, helped him plan and execute the takedown of their enemies. But she was still 9 years old. She was still a child who had been stolen from her bed and told she would never see her father again. "You don't have to be strong anymore," John said softly. "Not with me. Not ever again. Whatever you're feeling right now, scared, angry, sad, it's okay. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Isabella's composure cracked. The tears she had been holding back for weeks finally broke free, and she collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing with all the fear and pain she had kept bottled inside. John held her on the floor of the foyer, rocking her gently, letting her cry until there were no tears left. He didn't offer empty reassurances or try to fix what couldn't be fixed with words. He simply held her, letting her know through his presence that she was no longer alone. They didn't go upstairs that night. Instead, they made a bed of blankets and pillows in the living room and slept side by side, the way they had when Isabella was small and afraid of thunderstorms. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't practical. But it was what they both needed. The healing came slowly, in small steps and setbacks. John hired a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and Isabella began weekly sessions that helped her process what she had endured. There were nightmares, panic attacks, days when she couldn't bear to be alone even for a moment. But there were also good days, days when she laughed at something on television, when she asked to help John cook dinner, when she fell asleep peacefully without waking up screaming. John attended his own therapy sessions, though he told no one about them. He had spent so long being the strong one, the provider, the man who solved every problem through sheer force of will. Learning to acknowledge his own trauma, his own vulnerability, was harder than any business deal he had ever closed. But he did it. For Isabella, for himself, for the future they were building together. 1 month after the courtroom confrontation, John and Isabella returned to Oakwood Cemetery. The autumn had deepened. The trees were nearly bare now, their branches stark against the gray November sky. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground in shades of brown and gold. They walked together through the familiar paths until they reached the small marble headstone that had haunted John's nightmares for 6 months. Isabella Grace Harrison, beloved daughter forever 9. The grave was empty. It had always been empty, nothing but a lie carved in stone. Part 8. John had brought a sledgehammer from the garage. He set it on the ground beside the grave and looked at his daughter. "I used to come here every week," he said. "I would kneel right where you're standing and beg God to let me die so I could be with you again. This stone, this lie, almost destroyed me." Isabella reached out and touched the cold marble, tracing the letters of her own name. "They wanted to bury me," she said. "Not just in the ground, but in everyone's memory. They wanted to make me disappear so they could take everything from you." "But I didn't let them," John said. Isabella shook her head. "Neither did you." John picked up the sledgehammer and handed it to Isabella. It was heavy, too heavy for a 9-year-old to swing effectively. But this wasn't about effectiveness. It was about closure. Isabella gripped the handle with both hands, lifted the hammer as high as she could, and brought it down on the headstone. The impact sent a crack running through the marble. She swung again, and a chunk broke free. Again, and another piece fell away. John took the hammer from her trembling hands and finished the job. Swing after swing, he demolished the monument to his daughter's false death until nothing remained but rubble scattered across the grass. They stood together in the silence that followed, breathing hard, staring at the destruction they had wrought. Isabella spoke first, her young voice carrying a weight far beyond her years. "I wasn't born to be buried, Daddy." John felt his heart swell with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in the incredible strength of this child he had raised, sorrow for the innocence she had lost along the way. He knelt before her one final time, taking her small hands in his. "And I will live to protect you," he said, "every single day for the rest of my life." Isabella smiled, a real smile, the first one that had reached her eyes since before the nightmare began. "I know you will." In the months that followed, life slowly began to return to something resembling normal. Stella and Mark were convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ray received a lesser sentence in exchange for his testimony, but still faced decades behind bars. John returned to work, but with a different perspective. He stepped back from day-to-day operations, promoting younger executives and focusing instead on philanthropy. He established the Isabella Grace Foundation, dedicated to helping children who had survived trauma and abuse. Isabella returned to school, though she was homeschooled for the first year while she continued therapy. She made friends slowly, carefully, learning to trust again in small increments. The nightmares never completely disappeared, but they came less frequently. The panic attacks became manageable, and gradually, the girl who had been stolen, imprisoned, and forced to grow up too fast, began to reclaim pieces of the childhood that had been taken from her. On the anniversary of her escape, John and Isabella stood together in the cemetery where their nightmare had ended and their healing had begun. The shattered headstone had been removed. The ground had been smoothed over. In its place, John had planted a young oak tree. "It will grow stronger every year," John said, his arm around Isabella's shoulders. "Just like you." Isabella leaned against her father, watching the morning sun break through the clouds above them. "Just like us," she corrected. They stood there for a long while, father and daughter, survivors of a nightmare that should have destroyed them but had somehow made them stronger. Behind them lay the rubble of lies and betrayal. Ahead lay a future neither of them could have imagined just a year ago. Uncertain, scarred, but filled with possibility. They didn't look back. There was nothing behind them worth seeing anymore. This was not a story that ended with death. It was a story that began with love. A father's love for his daughter, a daughter's courage in the face of unspeakable darkness, and the unbreakable bond between two people who refused to let evil have the final word. As they turned and walked toward the cemetery gates together, Isabella's hand in her father's, the morning sun cast their shadows long across the grass. Not as two separate people, but as one united silhouette. Together they stepped into the light.